there's one game within the last 5 years I can truly say I've had mixed feelings about, it'd be Marvel's Avengers. It was one of those games that I continued to keep playing despite the fact that it felt largely unenjoyable to play. This wasn't exactly a new feeling for me since I also played Overwatch for the longest time, but I think Marvel's Avengers is unique in this regard because it's mostly a cooperative game that attempts to wear the mask of a single player one. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, this game isn't being supported anymore. You can no longer buy it on digital storefronts, and I'm sure sales of a fresh physical copy of this game is more than likely being bought by parents that just want a relatively cheap gift for their kids. So why am I doing this? Well, for one, I still have some personal unsettled beef with this game despite the fact that its support cycle ended a minute ago, and since I'm only really just getting started with this channel, I figured I might as well take the opportunity to document my thoughts on this game from a somewhat fresh perspective, so consider this a sort of reconciliation for me. And for two, I wanted to start with a game that features probably my favorite style of gameplay, that being more melee-focused beat-em-up hack-and-slash type shit. Though calling this game melee-focused can be a stretch sometimes, the DNA is still in there, somewhere. Also, I think it'll be interesting to look at this game without any of its active live service elements in a de facto definitive state. We were told from its very inception that all of its content is completely playable solo, while that didn't end up staying the case for some of its post-launch content, as well as some other promises it technically didn't bother keeping. It does mean that the creators, at least originally, intended for a large chunk of its content to be just as viable in a single-player environment as it is in a co-op environment, meaning that the overall package should still be playable for the few hundred people that still engage with it on Steam, which is a decent preservation measure I can appreciate, especially in today's video game landscape. Anyway, I'm only 4 videos in, and doing these type of intros is already about to make me crash out, so I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off and say that I like this game's story for the most part. While its ideas are pretty by the numbers, the execution itself is pretty solid. The crux of it lies on our heroes figuring out what actually happened on A-Day. Now check that out, we got another mystery box on our hands here. What I think makes this game's mystery box a little more interesting than, say, The Force Awakens is that it actually goes to the trouble of piecing things together. It starts with the unfinished reactor footage, then it migrates to Cap's reasoning for smashing the reactor, then it morphs into what Cap was concerned about when he smashed the reactor. While I wouldn't say these questions are the main dish of the story, I believe it creates a decent amount of pacing in between the character drama scrums, which is probably where most of the focus is at. Now, my knowledge of Marvel lore isn't exactly as extensive or encyclopedic as Star Wars, so I can't exactly say with full confidence how common a story like this is in its mythology, or whether or not Kamala was a good choice for the lead character compared to any other options within its universe at the time. But what I can say is that Kamala still does fit the bill for the kind of story this game is trying to tell. She's a quirky teenager that has a dad that loves her and heroes she believes in, even if that love can feel stifling at times and those heroes ain't what they used to be. I don't really find Kamala to be as annoying as other people might either. Then again, my tolerance for annoying characters in fiction might just be higher than average, but Kamala acts like a believable teenager to me. She starts geeking out when engaging with her interests.
I know I shouldn't be freaking out right now, but I'm freaking out. Tony Stark's guitar!
She's confused about her place in the world and what her powers mean. She displays a level of sincerity that you can really only find in the unwavering belief of a teenager.
Look, I know I messed up. I wanted to blame AIM so bad for what happened to me on A-Day, it blinded me. But Cap must have had a good reason for what he did. I know it.
Also, just look at these facial animations. This game dropped just 1 year after Jedi Fallen Order, at a time when niggas was taking the 5-finger discount because even the food stamps weren't enough anymore. And while I think this game looks way too washed out all the time, the difference in facial animation quality is stark. Details like this is something I think Crystal Dynamics has always been wizards at. Anyway, Kamala saying goofy or cliche shit is exactly what I expect a teenager to do in this position, especially in a genre of fiction that often tries to legitimize rather goofy and cliche things.
Go where?
It's not really something I could fault the fiction for wanting to explore, and I don't exactly think it does a terrible job at exploring it. Now, like I said, the game also isn't really getting any extra points for creativity here, but it still gets the job done. That goes for most of the other ideas in the story as well. I think one of my favorite moments is when Widow admits that she screwed up being Kamala's incognito handler. So one of the story's revelations is that Black Widow was Tiny Dancer, which is the person helping Kamala from the shadows at the start of the game, and isn't exactly a hard guess if you're somewhat familiar with Nat's character. When their impromptu meetup goes sideways for Kamala, a disguised Widow believes the best course of action is just to tell Kamala to stop running while she's currently being pursued by a small army. Like, seriously, what did she think was going to happen here? This kind of mistake definitely makes Nat look like an amateur, and she admits to it accordingly.
To be honest, Jersey wasn't my finest hour either.
How likely it would be for a character like Nat to make a mistake like this is a different conversation, but the fact that the fiction has enough self-awareness to acknowledge that Nat made a stupid mistake like this is something I can appreciate. This story was definitely written by people that know what they're doing, and even if some of the ideas they chose to pursue isn't exactly everyone's bag, and the representation of these characters is maybe only skin deep, I think they still pursue those ideas with a decent amount of respect and thought. And it's hard for me to say that any of the characters in this game were grossly misrepresented. Still, I'm far from a Marvel buff, so if you think there's any major inaccuracies here, feel free to say something in the comments. Now, you could argue that this game is called Marvel's Avengers and not Marvel's Miss Marvel. If we're just considering the campaign, you'd be right, since the Avengers don't start avenging until the post-game really. Each one of the launch characters does get some playtime during the campaign though, some a bit more than others, but I'd say the post-game is largely why the campaign is the way it is. It exists to help set up a more convincing post-game environment. This is mainly where I think the game's issues start to stem from. This attempt at trying to seamlessly mix single-player and multiplayer philosophies, and it starts with the campaign structure. This game absolutely loves its tutorials. Even after the opening segment, it will still routinely bombard you with information boxes telling you about your current hero's basics. It can get a little annoying when the pacing of the gameplay keeps getting broken up by info dumps. What's odd to me about how the game handles its tutorialization is that there's a training module for each hero in the game, meaning that there's already a feature that takes you through every hero's fundamentals. While the modules mostly serve as a reminder of how a hero's kit works, they could have also been placed at the beginning of every hero's first playable section as an optional tutorial. It's not like a lot of these actions are very difficult to figure out either. All you'd really lose is the part of the campaign that tutorializes the tutorials.
I'm Iron Man!
And I've already dealt with enough metafiction talking about the Star Wars sequel trilogy to last me at least the rest of the year. This moment in the campaign is pretty cute, for sure, but it also doesn't really add that much. I think you'd probably still be better off just removing the need for most of the basic hero actions being tutorialized during live gameplay. It'd also make replays of the campaign a little smoother as well. The parts of it that require the use of a specific heroic at a specific moment, and thus the game locks them off until that moment arrives, is usually for cinematic purposes. Video games attempting to be more and more like movies is a conversation that actually kind of fascinates me, and I do think there is a time and place for it. So the topic here is whether or not this game pulls it off well. There's an argument to be had on how much this approach limits the gameplay to a degree, since the game is kind of artificially handicapping itself, knowing that the player doesn't have access to all of the tools they could have, but it can also lead to satisfying moments that really only the medium of video games can offer when the game's intentions and the player's desires align. With that in mind, I don't really think this game pulls that feeling off all of the time in these moments, at least not for me. One that hits is when Kamala uses her Embiggen ultimate for the first time. In this context, her back is up against a wall, and she's forced to pull a trump card out of her ass. This is a decent character moment for her. One that I think is more of a miss is when Widow uses Veil of Shadows for the first time. In this context, she's literally doing it just to avoid one dude who had a very unfortunate guard duty shift that day. Imagine what this looks like on security footage. Your boy just trips over air and deactivates.
I was hoping for more of a fight.
What do you mean, Nat? You weren't looking for a fight here. This is the equivalent of choking someone out and then asking why didn't they breathe more afterwards. Ill-contextualized voice lines aside, I think this campaign's take on cinematic gameplay varies. What I also think varies is what you're made to do in the campaign. While most of it is just kicking ass, there are certain missions that require a little less ass kicking and a little more standing around in one spot waiting for a progress bar to fill up. Now, I'm not exactly of the mindset that a game's single-player campaign should always serve as some kind of preparation tool for its multiplayer experience. I think it's fine for a game's single player to feature mechanics and systems that aren't exactly completely transferable to its multiplayer, But you can tell that a lot of this game's campaign mission structure was crafted with the co-op experience in mind, evidenced by how some of these missions just throw you into a large empty biome and ask you to follow a waypoint. These play spaces just serve as an extra way for the player to gear grind by placing secondary objectives and random chests across this vast emptiness. Not to mention how some of these primary objectives are just kind of tedious. Seriously, sitting inside of a circle waiting for a download to finish while enemies are constantly layering attacks over you, all while the need to stay inside that little circle means the ways in which you can defend yourself from said enemies is severely handicapped, doesn't really sound like riveting gameplay to me in a combat brawler that encourages you to stay active, and the actual gameplay itself is just as mind-numbing. Your AI teammates are also pretty much dead weight under these conditions because they have no concept of target priority, which means you'll have to be the one to make sure that the objective gets completed, while also possibly dealing with the most dangerous enemies at the same time, all while you're forced to stand in one small-ass area. The point control objective is almost just as tedious, except now the game is asking you to engage with its funky movement system in order to cover all 3 consoles. Whenever this objective shows up, I don't even bother taking the 3rd console, especially if I'm not playing a flying character. It's just not worth the hassle of this game's traversal system that makes me feel like I'm on ice skates all the time, but is also way too sticky and clunky in other aspects. The absurd design of some of these play spaces also doesn't help either.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
And it's still more than enough to satisfy the game's arbitrary rating system if you at all care about gear drops at the end of missions. Sure, these objectives may play better in a co-op environment because people actually have brains and understand what they need to do to progress, but in solo play, these objectives are pretty obnoxious. It's fortunate that they only show up maybe like 3 times collectively throughout the story, but I feel like you could have also just made more unique missions in place of them instead, and it certainly doesn't make up for how frequently they appear in the post-campaign missions along with some other ones like the objective exclusive to Vault missions and select seeds of the Allied defense objective. These operation goals are just kind of poorly balanced for solo play. Not that they're impossible to complete, they just feel more irritating to engage with when Jarvis is constantly in your ear.
We just lost an access point. Return it to our control.
And your AI teammates are contributing very little real value, besides just taking some aggro off of you, all while you're basically being forced to ignore large aspects of this game's key feature, the combat. I get it though. Like, I understand that you can't just have every mission be exclusively about clapping robo-cheeks. While I personally wouldn't have a problem with that, it would probably get a little repetitive in the long term when this game was meant to support a very involved multiplayer suite over an extended period of time. I guess I just wish that the AI teammates didn't operate like single-celled organisms. Even just something as simple as a command wheel or some way to give your teammates basic orders would have went a long way here. The only thing you can really order your teammates to do is break open doors. You can't really make them do more significant things like target a specific enemy or watch a specific area. Your teammates only prioritize enemies that are nearby, meaning that usually they'll only really start fully engaging enemies once you've engaged with them. Not to mention how sometimes they'll just forget what they're supposed to be doing or start glitching out. When the objective is just to jump into the mix and send robots back to the production line though, the AI teammates are decent at doing that at the very least. You just might have to power them up yourself a little bit. Then there's the bosses, which I'd say this game's campaign only features 2 legitimately, and that's the Abomination fight and the final boss. Taskmaster only really half counts because he's the tutorial boss, so a lot of the progress you make during his fight is scripted, and the Monica boss is just her and a buffed up Exo. The only difference maker here is the fact that Nat and Monica are talking shit to each other.
Of course people are toys to you.
Not toys. Noble sacrifices to the greater good.
That guy bingo. Are you twisting your mustache inside that suit?
Which adds a small bit of context to the fight, but is mechanically not very different from fighting a modified Exo enemy. Any other boss during the story is just against giant AIM robots supported by ads. These bosses function similarly to how the objectives I just mentioned function, in that they were designed to play better in a multiplayer environment. These fights aren't all that engaging because all you're doing is just hunting down weak spots while avoiding the occasional projectile. Getting in position to damage those weak spots can also be a little tiresome, especially if your character can't fly. These bosses turn into elongated snooze fest because the player needs to be the one taking out the majority of those weak spots by themselves, while the AI teammates just dick around for most of the fight. The Abomination boss is really the only fight during the campaign that feels like a boss for a game like this. And while the final fight against MODOK is a little more involved, it's also still a little underwhelming gameplay-wise, since most of it is just mob fights capped off with a cinematic QTE sequence. And don't even get me started on the post-game bosses, which are either just the Abomination or Taskmaster fights again, with ads, just 4 times as goofy looking because the entire squad showed up to gang stomp their asses. This game's campaign just feels phoned in, partially due to its short length, but mostly because of how unambitious it is. The only worthwhile collectibles are the comics that only unlock minor stat boosts, and mostly just serve as a celebration of the source material that these characters come from, which is cool. They just aren't exactly very exciting to find. And the intelligence collectibles are decent world builders, but not exactly the most engaging kind of world builders for a video game. There's only maybe a handful of optional hero-specific missions that attempt to flesh out the world and the characters in a more interactive way, and despite the satisfaction of slowly watching the Chimera become fully operational and fully staffed again, its purpose as a hub area is only cosmetic at best, just like every other outpost in the game. You could argue they're only really here so you could play Fashion Avengers with your friends. The character interactions in them are cute, but it would have been nice to be able to do something like talk with NPCs to receive unique context-driven missions from them. The faction coordinators don't really count. They just exist to help boost your faction level with busywork tasks, which just has implications on the items their respective vendors can offer you. No wonder they eventually turned them into literal terminals. I remember when you actually had to go to each hub to pick these up. It's just a really weak campaign experience overall, that I can only surmise is because of the game's required multiplayer integration. If this campaign were allowed to stand on its own separate from the multiplayer experience, it probably wouldn't have been like this. And if I'm made to believe that the solo experience is supposed to be comparable to the co-op experience, then why does solo play feel like such an afterthought under these various conditions? For what it is, I suppose it serves its purpose, which is to ingratiate the player into the endgame loop. So what about that combat then? It's about as arcadey as it gets. Every hero has a number of universals, light and heavy melee combos with a signature or power alternative, a dodge and a ranged option. Every hero also has a defensive intrinsic as well that functions like a parry if timed correctly. Each hero's intrinsic varies, and most are used like a resource governed by the meter underneath the health bar. Some heroes need to actively charge this meter up, some charge passively, but the gist is, momentum. Oh yeah, every hero can also do a takedown when certain conditions are met. To round out the major universals, each hero has 3 heroics, an ultimate, support, and assault ability. These also charge up over time, as well as can be charged faster through certain perks and gear. In a vacuum, I dig this game's combat. Some characters are a bit more rigid than others, but there's still some cool stuff here. For instance, Widow's support heroic is practically a cheat code. I cannot tell you how liberating it feels to pop this ability and instantly not have to worry about a projectile coming at you every 10 seconds, most of the time. But what's really dope about it is with the right setup, you can practically dog walk any enemy in the game. Every character's heroics give them some kind of crazy setup like this. Where I think this combat's issues really creep up is with the enemy design. The way this game's difficulty scales isn't really predicated on giving enemies more complicated attack patterns to learn, but instead buffing their health pools, giving them more super armor and less hit stun. That in combination with just how aggressive enemies can be in this game means that it can still feel overwhelming at times when attempting to achieve any kind of flow state with this combat. There's a feeling of paranoia that I sometimes get with the amount of incessant warning markers that show up on the screen, which is why Widow's support heroic feels so liberating to me. What I find annoying about these markers though, is the fact that the meter filling up inside them is the indicator of how close the enemy is from firing their shot, not necessarily how close the projectile itself is from hitting you. That really only happens with homing projectiles, meaning that 9 times out of 10, you really don't have a good idea of when or how you should react to an off-screen attack, since not every projectile is equal in this game. Some projectiles are slow, others are faster. Some projectiles are just grenades, some are lasers. Some enemies are firing at you from across the room, some could be right behind you. Some projectiles can be armored through, others can't. Not to mention how inconsistent these indicators can be at times. There are moments when the game will say an enemy is about to shoot me, but then I'll never actually see a projectile whiz past me. I can imagine this either means the projectile hit an obstacle or a teammate before reaching me, or the game is just bugging out. There are other times where motherfuckers are so far away, but still technically on screen, that the game just says fuck it, they'll see this, right? As it then proceeds to layer me with a completely different off-screen attack. If this was still 2020, that bullshit would have dropped me faster than the 5-point exploding heart technique. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The opposition in this game is mostly curated for the co-op environment, meaning that some enemies still have to pose some kind of threat even when the possibility of all 4 heroes wailing on one happens. This is why they rely so heavily on armor, invincibility, and extremely obnoxious projectile spam. In this context, there's essentially 3 ways to engage enemies efficiently, depending on what character you're playing. You either find a way to keep them stun-locked with attacks, pepper them with ranged attacks, or just deal with whatever they throw at you accordingly if your character lacks effective consistency in those other options, and just hope your heroics can do enough. But boiling down the combat to these strategies means that you tend to end up ignoring all of the other options your character's kit has. This game can sometimes feel like that's necessary though, due to just how aggressive and numerous the enemies can be, especially in the more challenging missions. If you do manage to find a flow state though, there is a decent combat experience here. It can just be inconsistent, so your mileage may vary from hero to hero. Some of the more challenging enemies like the Adaptoids and Exos take a bit more effort to stagger, and there are just some characters that don't need to use a lot of resources to either completely bypass the need for that stagger, or achieve it without too much trouble compared to others. For instance, with Black Widow, I can't remember the last time I've ever voluntarily used her ultimate, because her support and assault heroics in combination with her guns is usually more than enough. Meanwhile, with characters like Cap or Hulk in similar situations, I often feel the need to blow through all of their heroics in one sitting. Some characters just need to work a little harder than others at times, which isn't necessarily a problem by itself, but when every character is basically working for the same reward, you start to see those differences in every character's kits as deficiencies. A more focused build for your hero and heroics can mitigate this, but it's still always going to feel better to remove an enemy's overshield with Kate's scattershot arrow than it would be to just wail on them with Hulk or Kamala's melee attacks, because since the enemy takes very little hit stagger with the overshield, it means there's no real reason to waste energy hitting them with melee attacks, since they'll either just completely ignore you or make you deal with a super armored move, which just makes for an overall less satisfying gameplay experience from the top down, because characters like Hulk and Kamala's ranged attacks are just super clunky feeling to use compared to something like Scattershot Arrow. This doesn't mean that any one hero on the roster is completely unplayable, but I also wouldn't say that playing this game like a traditional brawler is better than playing it like a third-person shooter most of the time. You can still make it work, but when more dangerous enemies are in the mix, it becomes a bigger chore. This is all while playing on the Challenge 2 or higher difficulties, which just changes how tanky the enemies are, and how dangerous certain attacks can be. While the combat can be fun at times, I ultimately don't think it's conducive to a smooth gameplay experience because there's just too much inconsistency everywhere. There's too much inconsistency with the off-screen attack markers. There's too much inconsistency with how enemies behave. There's too much inconsistency in the way some of your projectiles behave. The auto-targeting can often be way too aggressive at times. Your AI teammates are blockheads that only understand the strategy of Unga Bunga. The list goes on. These issues really bog down the gameplay, which is a shame because I do think there's some good stuff here. I think Widow's grappling hook is fun to mess around with when you get a good flow going. I think Kate's teleporting gimmick is super dope. Demolishing the Ops almost exclusively with Iron Man's rockets is hilariously overpowered. All of this is just kind of buried underneath a layer of jank that makes things a little harder to engage with than it needs to be. And you can't exactly expect every player to just accept the jank in order to get to the fun. As someone who grew up playing Sonic games, this was a natural adaptation for me. But for a game that did have significant multiplayer functionality, even if it wasn't always functioning, and an extremely grindy endgame, some people may have a lower tolerance for bullshit gameplay.
Hey there, ho there! You wanna see what I've been cooking up?
I remember at this game's launch, common complaints about the gear was that it wasn't exciting. It doesn't add much to the gameplay. It's not visual. And while I think some aspects about the gear does add a little bit, like the status effects and certain defensive perks, it's also just kind of there. Like, again, you can tell the system is only really here to support the multiplayer philosophy. It's not here because the game really needed it. The fact that the gear isn't cosmetic only strengthens this case, since we can guess it was to further boost skin sales. But without the gear system, there'd be fewer things for the player to grind for. It's just that the gear itself largely isn't worth being concerned over. The system is simple enough. A collection of several attributes increases the overall stats of your character, and gear pieces can come with a maximum of 3 different attributes, so then it's up to the player to focus on the attributes they want as best they can for the type of build they're going for, all while making sure they get a high quality set of perks with each piece. This kind of gear system only really appeals to people that want to absolutely min-max the shit out of their builds. To the average person though, all they're doing is just watching the big number go up. Either way, the dopamine rush of getting new gear in this game I think wears off pretty quickly, because if you're a person that cares about maximizing your build, you're going to be pretty disappointed by most of the drops you get. And if you're a person that doesn't care about maximizing, it just wants to mess around with all the different perk sets, you're probably going to get pretty bored of them by the time you get close to max power level, which at that point you might as well start min-maxing. I at least appreciate the fact that they changed the upgrade system from being strictly resource based and every piece of gear only having a limited number of upgrades to allowing lower level gear to consume higher level gear. The original upgrade system made it pretty hard to stick with a piece of gear you may have actually liked, because once you maxed out its upgrades, you were basically artificially limiting your progression. This only applies to purple or higher tier gear, and only if its base power level is 100 or higher, but it effectively means you can stick with a piece of gear all the way up until max power level if you want to. Still, I believe this game only has a gear system to make up for the fact that the missions in which you pursue that gear through are kind of bland. Imagine doing these missions without a consistent gear payout at the end. Anybody who runs these missions purely for the joy of doing them either just really likes the combat or is insane. I'm personally probably closer to the second possibility myself for making this video. I think the character skill tree is a lot more interesting in comparison to the gear, even before they added the champion skill tree, which is just minor permanent stat boosts. The primary skill trees I think do a bit more to add some dynamic gameplay. Characters definitely feel a lot more capable with maxed out skill trees, meaning the progression you make through them feels a lot more tangible. The selectable skills also have more potential to influence playstyle. Being able to choose between making the Widow's Bite heroic a ranged payload or an electric Falcon Punch is cool, and I kind of wish you could customize more heroics in the game like this. While most other selectable skills either just change the properties of your heroics and actions, or just give stat boosts and bonuses to certain actions, you can still cobble up a combination that fits well enough to how you like to play the hero. I'd say the way this game handles the character skill trees is actually one of the more unique things about it. It just kind of sucks that it's in a game that made it so uninteresting to grind out a character at all. I'm not really going to talk about the Hawkeye or Black Panther post-launch content, because they're pretty much all of the same quality as the launch content. In fact, I'd say they're possibly worse in some aspects because they add even more obnoxiously designed enemies, objectives, and mechanics. These additions make the game a little harder for the player, which you could argue the base game content was a little too easy in some aspects, but I think it also kind of displays a lack of understanding for what actually makes the gameplay fun, which is feeling like an overpowered cheek plower. These additions largely don't really do anything besides just further get in the way of that feeling, and I can't exactly do things like the raid because it requires more than one player to participate. While you can still play with other players because the connection is peer-to-peer, I didn't feel it was worth the trouble of trying to get a squad together if possible. Honestly, I'm just kind of surprised this game's support lasted even 3 years after launch. I was sure they were going to pull the plug much earlier. I'm not even really someone who thinks the mere concept of live service games are terrible. While they also aren't really games I tend to gravitate towards very often, I think with the right vision they can be fine. Marvel's Avengers is a game that had a really unclear vision, or at the very least, the vision that it had wasn't realized very well. While you can blame this on the live service aspects, this also isn't necessarily a problem exclusive to live service games. This game essentially wanted to homogenize its single player and co-op philosophies into one seamless video game, but all that ended up doing was giving us a watered down campaign and a gameplay loop that makes me want to ignore like 70% of the post-game missions. So does this mean that it's pretty much impossible to do what Marvel's Avengers tried to do? Honestly, I don't really know. The optimist in me wants to say no, but I also personally can't think of any game that attempts to make the same kind of effort in the way Marvel's Avengers does. If any of y'all know an example, feel free to leave one in the comments. As far as this game goes, it's fitting that the kickoff point of its story is about a failed experiment, because that's essentially what it is. There just isn't enough substance here for either single player or co-op enthusiasts, because the game was designed in an attempt to please both at the same time, and it ended up pleasing very few as a result. Still, I'm glad I decided to take another look at this game, because if nothing else, it allowed me to settle some thoughts that's been nagging at me about it. I've never had a more satisfying feeling of hitting that uninstall button, especially as someone who has hit the uninstall button multiple times in the past with this game for various reasons. So it feels good to finally formulate a definitive reason for myself on why I like certain aspects of this game, but ultimately think it just kind of blows, such as the cycle of the modern player, I guess. At least you can still play this game if you still own it. You may run into some optimization issues on PC, which you've probably seen more than enough of in this video, and isn't exactly new for this game, but it's more than what people got from the crew when Ubisoft gave it the kibosh, so it ain't all bad.